We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
And if Joe Biden is able to win this state, he will have accomplished something that we rarely see here, which is a Democrat winning state office. Even President Obama was unable to win here.
A single Republican has been able to look at any one of these mail ballots. They could be from Mars, as far as we're concerned, or they could be from the Democratic National Committee.
Joe Biden won, but some people say the Democrats, lost because they lost many incumbent lost many incumbent races. For instance, in Florida, 5 incumbents lost. Why did that happen per se?
Well, we don't know yet why it did happen. We're still unpacking what happened in this election, but I want to throw a couple of things on the table that people might be talking about or maybe are not talking about. So the first thing to throw on the table is that the top of the ticket was a real turnoff for a lot of people this year. A lot of people voted against Donald Trump. They didn't necessarily vote for Joe Biden. They voted against Donald Trump. And I think you can see that in the down ticket races where people might have voted against Trump at the top of the ticket, but then gone ahead and split the ticket and voted for Republican candidates locally. And that's a real question is about messaging. Was the Democrats' message about COVID, which is what they really doubled down on, effective in places like Florida? They hoped that it would be. Perhaps it wasn't. So that we don't really know the answer to yet. But another thing that I think is going to be very important in the way we look at this election is on the delivery of votes. So people are talking about how it's not such a great Democratic victory or anything. I want to put that to rest. This was a huge Democratic victory. Right now, as we are speaking, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are up by more than 5 million votes, and they've won decisively in the Electoral College. This is a big win, but it's a big win despite the fact that there's a pandemic on, and despite the fact that there was a concerted effort on the part of the administration to depress the turnout of Democrats, both by depressing the delivery of ballots through the United States Postal Service, and also by trying to make sure people couldn't vote in places like Texas, where they managed to shut down most of the drive-through balloting. They were all places in Texas where they got rid of drop boxes. There were all kinds of ways that the administration tried to depress voter turnout. And that, even though it was quite high, is I think something that has to be in the mix, because there's an awful lot of places where it looks like there might have been higher Democratic turnout than there was. So I was actually concerned going into this election that the Democrats simply weren't going to be able to overcome the tactics that were in place to make sure they couldn't win. They appear to have done so in a pretty dramatic way, and you can tell that's not playing real well with members of the administration right now.
You saying that the Democratic Party won in big numbers, but what about their progressive agenda, their progressive movement? Do you think that this showed that the progressives and the moderate sides of the Democrats, they can work together, or was this more divisive? Or do you think that there's a future to this?
This is a really interesting question, because when people look at the two parties that we have right now, the two majority parties that we have right now, the two main parties that we have right now, they look at the Republicans and the fact that the Republicans have managed to have a really solid, clear message really since 1980. Not entirely. I mean, there was a fight from 80 to the mid 90s between the traditionalists in the party and the movement conservatives in the party. And now it's been taken over by the movement conservatives, and they speak with one voice. And Americans look at that, or certainly political pundits look at that, and they say, oh, everybody should be like the Republicans. Look, they've got a very clear message. Well, look, the Republicans no longer have a majority. They've got a minority, and they're staying in power through gerrymandering and voter suppression. This is pretty clear. That, to me, is not a success story. And then they look at the Democrats and say, oh, it's a circular firing squad. How can you ever get these different branches to work together, the progressives on the one hand and the traditionalists on the other, and to some degree, if there are any blue dogs left, the blue dogs. And I would look at that and say, this is actually a really healthy thing. If you're looking at a country that currently really has a two-party system, you want those parties to be big tent parties, because what's going to fly in Massachusetts for a Democrat is absolutely not going to fly in Mississippi for a Democrat. at least for a white Democrat. So, so to me, the fact that there seems to be a wide range of voices in the Democratic Party is actually a very healthy thing. It's just that the Democrats haven't necessarily figured out internally what that looks like. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that is if you think back to the primaries and what happened when Joe Biden emerged as the primary candidate, he was very, very careful to reach out to progressives, especially to the Sanders people, and to try and bring them behind his agenda and to work with them. And I have every expectation that his cabinet is going to reflect the different voices in the administration or in the Democratic Party. And that is precisely what Abraham Lincoln did. And everybody at the time, when we were talking about Obama's cabinet, everybody thought this was just ducky and that this was the way it should be done. So why that now it's happening under a Biden administration, people seem to think it's not a healthy thing. I don't quite understand. So what I see here is one party trying to be inclusive and have a lot of voices, and the other party doubling down on a narrower and narrower vision. And just speaking as somebody who's interested in the way that our political system works, I really don't see the Republican Party system as working so long as we have widespread voting. If they can control who gets to vote, then yeah, it's a great message. You find the people who respond to that single message, you cut everybody else out of the electorate and you win elections, but that's no longer a democracy. If in fact we focus on expanding the vote, which is the direction I think we're going, the democratic system seems to me to be a lot more viable.
Biden administration is going to be a repeat? Do you think his rhetoric kind of shows that? Because he's a compromise candidate. He said that in his speech, right? I'm going to be the American president. But then does that mean that does that necessarily mean he is going to, compromise on issues that some people believe we cannot afford to compromise on?
So one of the things that people are talking about when they talk about progressives and the moderates, and I always have to laugh because Joe Biden is always firmly right in the middle of the Democratic Party. So one of the things that I would think about when we think about the future, and again, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but the things that are being defined right now as progressive in America are actually not terribly progressive at all. They're actually remarkably conservative. So when people talk about the squad, for example, many of their policies are to the right of Eisenhower's. So, you read about people being upset at Joe Biden's tax policy, that somehow in the fever swamps of the right wing it says, or the right wing internet, it says, he's going to raise taxes through the roof and so on. He's actually calling for taxes to go back to the corporate taxes to go back to where they were before Trump's tax cuts. And for the tax, the upper income tax bracket for the rates of taxation on people who make over $400,000 a year to go up. Under Eisenhower, that top tax bracket, people who made more than $400,000 a year, that tax bracket was 91%. Now, I don't see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or the other people associated with the squad, or Bernie Sanders, or Joe Biden, talking about any 91% upper tax bracket. So one of the things that may happen going forward is a recognition that these progressives are really not that far from what was actually considered somewhat conservative only a generation ago. And that's one of the things, they're not asking for a redistribution of wealth. They're not asking for a redistribution of property. They're certainly not asking for the government to take over the means of production, which is what socialism really is about. They're simply asking for us to return the country to the system that worked for us so many times before. So my guess is what we're going to see going forward is a redefinition of those terms rather than the sense that we're going to be pulled terribly far to the left.
What strategy did President Trump use to win? I mean, I would think, because you get Roger Stone with him, it was kind of the Southern strategy, but more of 2016, more modern mix. So why didn't it work? Why don't you think it worked? Or at least it did, but did Biden do better when it came to the numbers because more people voted, obviously? Because still many people voted for President Trump. I think around 70 million people.
So there's something very interesting about the 2016 election that that people are shocked when I say this. Donald Trump ran along the lines of the rhetoric that the Republicans had been using since 1980, and he certainly stripped all the veneer off it. Rather than dog whistles, he had bullhorns. We weren't going to talk about taxes and welfare queens. We were going to talk about Mexican immigrants being rapists and criminals. So he certainly ran with that, and that attracted a lot of people for sure. But the piece that always shocks people when I say it, but I promise you, if you look back, it's true. Trump actually ran as a more moderate candidate than anybody else who was running for the nomination that year. So while other people were talking about being pro-business and continuing down the road that the Republican Party had gone on, Trump talked about fixing tax loopholes, about everybody paying their fair share, not about getting rid of the Affordable Care Act. He talked about making it better, including more people in it, making it cheaper. And he actually talked about certainly the racism and sexism that we now know was the heart of who he is. But he also talked about an economic populism, bringing jobs back, making taxes fair, that the other Republicans did not. And I think he picked up a lot of people who believed that he was going to be an economic moderate, that they thought the Republicans had gone too far in their economic extremism in favor of big business. And Trump offered to bring the party back to a more moderate stance. Now, he didn't govern that way at all. He did just the opposite. But I think he lost a lot of his voters because he promised things like that healthcare plan that we still haven't seen.
Language is that still like present in America today, or at least maybe, as you said, not President Trump is more overt about his rhetoric, but at least with supporters. Does that make sense? With like, when people say those words, do you think they're a resemblance of, hey, like this was once racially neutral language?
The rhetoric of the right wing now and their ability to wall themselves off in a fictional world is really frightening, especially with the rise now of QAnon and One America News Network, and of course the Fox News Channel, but 4chan and 8chan and all the places that people can hang out and hear a world that doesn't exist. So one of the things that I think switched a lot of Hispanic voters over to Trump was their fears of socialism. And as I keep saying till I'm blue in the face, the Democrats have never stood for socialism. That's a very American construct that reaches back to Reconstruction. It has very little to do with what we understand as international communism, the idea of the government owning the means of production, and through the government, the people owning the means of production. The people who advocate that in America are very few and far between, and they're not in power. But that threat of America becoming Venezuela, I think, was very powerful, because it is possible now in America to live in a world where you literally believe that Donald Trump is running a secret organization that is bringing down a group of pedophiles who exercise cannibalism. And it's dominated by the Democratic Party. And there are a lot of people who believe that. And this, to me, is the real fear going forward, that we don't reclaim a political discourse that's based in reality.
Also able to convince supporters that voter fraud is something that is real and that it is happening. The numbers show that it's 0.000025%. And so what's Trump's strategy there? Why is he doing this? What's happening right now in the court cases that he said in his victory speech, quote unquote, on that Wednesday 2:30 a.m. That he's going to go to the Supreme Court. So what's going on with that?
Well, that's a really great example, because what Trump has always done so brilliantly is to go ahead and manipulate the narrative. and try to convince people of things that are not true. And of course, this shows in things like the whole fight over Hillary Clinton's emails. Now, most people don't know there was a State Department report about those emails, and they exonerated Clinton, but it stayed in the news and determined the direction of the 2016 election by hammering on it again and again and again. And by the way, it isn't Trump who invented this system. Newt Gingrich used it very effectively as well. It's been in the Republican Party for a while now, but Trump used that then, and you can see he tried to do it last summer with the call to Vladimir Zelensky on July 25th of 2019, where he tried to get him not to start an investigation into Hunter Biden, but to announce he was starting one into Hunter Biden. The idea was always to manipulate the media so that people heard the news. And if you hear it enough, you start to believe it, even if it isn't true. So what you see right now is, let me be very clear, there is no doubt that Joseph R. Biden and Kamala Harris won this election, and they won it by a lot. This is not a squeaker. This is a legitimate election. And he's trying desperately to convince his supporters that it's not a legitimate election. And he's doing it by launching all these lawsuits. And if you listen to the Fox News channel, what you will hear again and again is the talk about the lawsuit here and the lawsuit there, and there are all these lawsuits. What they're not telling you is those lawsuits are all getting dismissed out of hand, because some of them they're entering without even doing the right paperwork. And the idea, again, is not really to have the courts step in, because they have no evidence. They're literally, these things are getting thrown out because there is no evidence. There are poll watchers from the Republican Party. There is no evidence of fraud. But what they want to do is seed this story into the media so that more and more people believe it. And that will enable them to create this chaos around the election that they are hoping will mean either that the states don't certify the election results on December 8th the way they're supposed to do, which throws open on some new possibilities for deciding the election, or to get it thrown into the Supreme Court, where they're hoping, at least Trump is hoping, that the Supreme Court will decide in his favor. This would be a radical departure from the vote. It would essentially be a coup. And there's no reason to expect, at least from where I sit, that the courts are going to go along with this. Certainly, they're not deciding in his favor at all on any of the things he's bringing forward. But he's trying to try this in the court of public opinion, again, with the idea either that this can go forward and he will retain the presidency, or if you look, you will see that they are raising a significant amount of money from donors to fight this legal battle. But of course, as the Wall Street Journal broke 2 days ago, that money isn't actually going to the legal battle. It's going to retiring the Trump's debt from the Trump campaign's debt from the 2020 election, and the Republican National Committee's debt.
What do you think, again, happens after that? What is the future of democracy? Because, does the Republican Party, do they stick with President Trump, or do they leave him? What happens with 2022 or 2024, right? Will we continue to see this rhetoric, right? Does the election results show that we've moved on? Because I don't think that there's going to be this type of voter turnout ever again. At least in my opinion. And so how does this? I think democracy won for sure because so many people voted. But then, will this continue? Does this continue?
American democracy is in a crisis. It just is. And I don't mean that necessarily just surrounding this election, although obviously we're in trouble with this election when the current president refuses to recognize the results. So that's a crisis in and of itself. But we have another crisis as well, and that is that the mechanics of our democracy do not reflect the majority of the American people. So, for example, we've had either 6 out of 7 or 7 out of 8 of the last presidential elections have put in power a president who does not win the majority of the popular vote. That's a problem. That's a problem when Americans don't feel that the president reflects what they want. Similarly, we now have our government really being directed by, at this point, a Senate Majority Leader who represents, one half of a small state, the state of Kentucky. And he is bottling up all legislation because he's not going to bring it forward. That's not democracy, when people feel that things can't get an up or a down vote. When our Senate is dominated by a party that represents about 15 million fewer people than the Democrats do, That's a problem. So we have a problem, and we have a Supreme Court now that's been appointed by presidents who have not won the popular vote. I believe that since Nixon, as I recall off the top of my head, Democrats have appointed 4 Supreme Court justices and Republicans 16. Now, this is not a reflection of democracy, and all of these things represent a problem with our mechanics, and that simply has to be fixed. Either we are going to, whether you're Republican, whether you're a Democrat, no matter who you are, if we want to retain a democracy, we must retain a representative mechanical structure. And right now we do not have a representative mechanical structure, and that's going to have to be fixed, or we're going to lose democracy. Now, you just said that people aren't going to turn out in the future. Here's what I would say: demographic change. Right now, millennials and downward already outnumber the baby boomers by a lot. They overtook the baby boomers, I believe it was in August of 2016. The people who are keeping the current regime in power are dying off. We know that young people are going to the Democratic Party in unbelievable numbers. And one of the reasons that South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham recently said that if we didn't change the system, a Republican president would never again be elected. Well, yeah, because the young people coming in are not supporting the current day Republican Party. So there is going to be a change. The question is, when is that change going to happen, and what is it going to look like? And that I don't think I can predict, except to say I'm 100% certain it's coming.